There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel, and I'm here for a very special conversation with a new favorite author, I think I might be so bold as to say. This is Allan Radcliffe, a Scottish novelist, joining us from near Edinburgh to talk about his debut novel, The Old Haunts, which came out in 2023. This is the kind of softcover edition from Fairlight Press, and there is also a paperback-sized edition from the same publisher. And I just finished reading it the day before yesterday, and here we are. It's extremely fresh in my mind, and I want to welcome Allan, who was my mystery guest some months ago. There'll be a link to that chat in the show notes. Welcome, Allan, back to my channel.
Thank you. Lovely to be here again, Sean.
Oh, my pleasure. And I just have to say, my goal here is not to gush too much, but I absolutely loved The Old Haunts. It couldn't have been more of a Sean book. And I read this to my cousin, Mary Jean, night after night on Facebook Messenger. And she also said, I can't think of one bad thing to say about this. This is just lovely. So we both absolutely loved it. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. Hey, this is Editing Sean. I didn't make any comments about spoilers, and I have considered the matter deeply as I was editing. This is a character-driven novel, and it's a very quiet novel. It is such a Sean book. There isn't a lot that happens. The only thing I can think of that isn't on the synopsis is the connection between Jamie and Kit. Kit is the owner of the holiday house where Jamie and his boyfriend Alex stay for a few days, and that's not a spoiler, but that's the only thing that we talk about that isn't on the back cover. So there's no such thing as a spoiler in the discussion that follows. Allan, give us the opening premise for The Old Haunts.
The novel takes place over two time frames. In the framing narrative, Jamie, who's in his 30s, and his actor boyfriend, Alex, take a trip into the heart of Scotland. It's kind of rural Perthshire. And they're making this trip ostensibly so that Jamie can deal with his grief at the loss of both his parents. Both of his elderly parents have died recently. But they're also going on this trip in search of a house. It's a particular house that Jamie remembers from his childhood, from one of these mythical childhood holidays where everyone had a good time and it's really stuck with him. By coincidence, Alex, his boyfriend, grew up nearby, so they both know the area. And in the process of searching for this house, it sparks off memories of Jamie's childhood and growing up in Edinburgh in the 80s and 90s, and his awareness of his burgeoning sexuality at a time when it was very difficult to be growing up gay because we had Section 28, where the promotion of homosexuality or any kind of education about homosexuality was banned in schools. And also there was the backdrop of the AIDS crisis, which meant that the atmosphere around conversations around homosexuality were all really quite negative and toxic. So in that sense, this is a time that Jamie's looking back on his childhood, where he goes from being in a very tight unit with these two wonderful, loving parents, and the slow estrangement that occurs as he becomes aware of his sexuality and aware that in some ways he has to hide something from these parents. So he's looking back with regret, but he's also looking back in a way to tell himself the story of his life with his parents. And in that sense, the book builds a bridge between a time of negativity and hostility and prejudice and the kind of tentative hope and acceptance of today.
Absolutely. Very well done, sir. I'd also like to have you talk about, and if you don't mind, read the epigraph to the novel, which comes from a Robert Frost poem.
Yeah, it's a very famous poem. In some ways, I didn't realize quite how famous it was until people I knew started picking up the book and saying, oh, yes, that poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. My mother had that printed on a tea towel or that's one of my favorite poems. I think it is one of Frost's most anthologized poems. But the epigraph is from the final lines. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And I just felt that those lines absolutely encapsulated the journey that Jamie's going on in this story. Not because he has any kind of death wish. I think that some people have interpreted this poem as being about someone who has an attraction towards death. But I think that in the event of a death, in the event of grief, he's trying to find ways to go on. This is what we all do, I think, when sad or serious things happen to us. When we're grieving, we go back into the past. We try to tell ourselves the story of our lives, and then we try to find ways to go on. And I think in that sense, that's why his sort of burgeoning relationship with Alex is just as important as the story about his relationship with his parents and about their death and his bereavement at that. In some ways, I was just as interested in writing about what comes next for Jamie in his life as much as writing about the finality of his parents' deaths and how he processes that.
Absolutely. And so the first line here, the reference to the woods, I mean, they are literally in the woods, or they're trekking through the woods in search of this childhood memory of a house for Jamie. And to resonate with what you just said, there's two key words or phrases for me that, because of which I really agree with the interpretation you've just put on it and the resonance with this story. The first one is the conjunction, but is doing some heavy lifting here, and then miles just to go. So yeah, in terms of, I don't see anything, I don't know the whole poem at all, but it is not a death wish. It's a taking stock in the midst of some fresh grief and carrying on. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and in some ways, death in and of itself is a kind of, it's an inert subject for story, for drama. It's actually what comes next is the more important thing. It's the engine of the story. And so in that sense, I've always felt that it was very important that Jamie has options beyond the situation that he finds himself. I never wanted it to be just a book about grief. I wanted it to be, there's that famous Samuel Beckett quote, I can't go on, I'll go on. So that even in the most difficult circumstances, what does it take to keep moving?
absolutely. And I think that's a good segue into, if you don't mind, reading the very opening section of The Old Haunts. The chapter titles in your novel are lovely, and this one is We Don't Drink Beer. Please read the short opening section.
Yep, sure. After the house was sold, we drove north to Omri, a cinematic place at the western end of Loch Tay. My head had been full of grey, a sky with no sunshine, and Alex thought the change of scene might help turn me back into myself. It was March suddenly. The year was pulling at its reins. Alex had surprised me with a crumpled printout, brandished like a long-stemmed rose. He knew our destination well, having grown up nearby, and he knew that I had taken that holiday there with my family, so it was a meaningful place for both of us. We kept pausing on the drive up so he could get out of the car with his camera and marvel at all his old haunts.
So there's the title right there, The Old Haunts. The first of many places I gasped in this novel was in this section. The year was pulling at its reins. Lovely line. I guess the obvious question is, why did you, maybe it's too obvious, but why did you choose to situate this story in this place over this short time period at this time in these two men's lives, especially Jamie's life?
To answer that properly, I have to go back to the kind of genesis of the book in a way. The original kind of inspiration for the book was my finding a book of fairy tales, which was my book, and I still have it. It was very well used, read, loved. And I was reminding myself, as soon as I opened the book, it brought back a lot of memories for me of being read stories at bedtime. And because the book was full of these absolutely toe-curling illustrations, it conjured up a kind of sense both of safety of being read to in bed by my parents, but also a kind of safety mixed with fear and the delight in fear. And looking back over some of these stories, I was really struck by how often the kind of subtext of these tales is about children either bereaved or trying to navigate their way in a kind of alien landscape or a very kind of harsh landscape, usually a forest, without their parents and having to rely on their own resources, their own ingenuity, and so on. And so that was really what I wanted to do in the end, was to write a story about an adult who had recently lost his parents. So a child, but an adult child, suddenly losing both parents at the same time, having been closed. And I thought that would be an interesting way to look back on the life of a gay man and how, in some ways, he had grown as a person and how his life had changed. At the same time, this inevitably involved a kind of lessening of the bond with his parents and the regret that came with that. And I suppose the regret that a lot of queer people of that generation had when it came to their relationships with their parents, because it wasn't often a relationship that was based on hiding and secrets, half-truths. So that was really the kind of starting point for me. And I always knew that there would be a rural setting to the framing narrative. But within that, I had the enjoyment of it being a book of contrasts. So there was the kind of rural environment of this present day story contrasted with his Edinburgh upbringing, and also he moves away to London to go to art school. There's the contrast between Jamie and Alex. They're around the same age, but they're both very different kinds of characters. There's the contrast, obviously, generational gap and the differences, I suppose, amusing and also somewhat tragic differences that come in with the generations. With that premise and that sort of, I suppose, image of these fairy tales, I was able to conjure up quite a lot from that, I think. And interestingly, the original cover image, which I had nothing to do with, is a very sort of fairy tale Hansel and Gretel type image of two figures walking hand in hand through a forest.
Absolutely.
You know,
They must have read the epigraph. Jamie, such a richly nuanced character. And I think of loneliness and solitude as being quite different. And he seemed to exude both. And the loneliness, I felt, was so linked to keeping the secret of his sexuality. And as close as he felt to his parents, it was virtually impossible for him to really share who he was with his parents. His childhood, he didn't really seem to have close friends. He was just a real kind of loner type. And seeing him as an adult with Alex, maybe he feels lonely in his grief, but he's a very solitary soul. And it's something that's really quite beautiful about him. That wasn't a
Yeah,
question, but I'll see what you have to say to that.
I think in the early part of the novel, because in these flashback sections, I take it right back to Jamie's childhood, his early memories, however reliable those are. And I think that in those initial stages, he has a really keen sense of himself, as a lot of children do, of being part of a family unit and of being part of a team with his parents. And in some ways, part of the story is the way in which the outside world encroaches to gradually pull that unit apart, that sort of perfect. I think Iris Murdoch, who was also an only child, she called her relationship with her parents a perfect trinity of love. And I feel like Jamie has that with his mum and dad, and gradually he becomes estranged from them. But there are all kinds of things that intervene to make that happen. First of all, when he goes to school and he asks his mum years later in disbelief, "Why did you leave me there?" And I think that it's a feeling that a lot of children who have had a happy home life have about going to school. Obviously, the opposite happens as well. If you have a very difficult home life, school can be a refuge. But for Jamie, it's just too much. It's too noisy. It's lonely. It's amazing how lonely you can be in such a chaotic and excitable atmosphere. But there are other things as well. When his parents run a newsagent and when Jamie is at a kind of formative age, early teens, he finds the magazine with the full frontal male centerfold in it. He's thrilled, but he also has an understanding that this is something he has to keep from his parents. And he steals the picture, but he knows that this is something that is not to be spoken about. And it's not something he entirely understands, but he instinctively knows that they won't be happy about this. And later on, there's a scene where they're watching television and someone is interviewing a young pop star on television, and the mum just nonchalantly lifts her head and said, "Oh, is he a poof?" And the dad confirms this. It's the kind of conversation that under different circumstances, no one would bat an eyelid. But of course, for Jamie, this is devastating. So there are lots of reasons for that kind of retreat within himself. And he becomes quite a quiet, sort of watchful person. But he does blossom in some ways when he moves away.
Absolutely. Parents don't usually come off very well in literary fiction. I think that can safely be said. And well, the parents in the old haunts are deeply nuanced and not without their flaws. They are, I have to say, the most endearing, loveliest parents I've met in literary fiction in a long time. And as an illustration of this, and this is just one facet of them, but it's a lovely facet. Could you read the short section from the chapter called Make Light that gives us a little taste of what they were all about?
Yep, sure. My mother had this incredible full-throated chuckle, and when my father laughed, his whole head went back. Seeing them like this, limp with laughter, made me want to keep telling them the best joke they'd ever heard. I had seen that they were often wound tight with worry. Now, I thought, it was my job to make light, to lighten them. Let there be light. My dad said it every evening when he turned on the big lamp in the living room, splaying his fingers like a magician.
Just come in all three dimensions in that short passage. And I think now we can't put it off any longer. Tell us about, there's another character that I would say plays maybe an outsized role in shaping this story. And that is what would you call her? The landlady, the owner of the holiday place that they're staying, Kit. Tell us about Kit. I loved her so much.
Yeah, in some ways, originally, when I first started writing this book, there was no Alex. Alex wasn't part of the story originally, and I very quickly realized that I needed an Alex, both as a foil to Jamie and also to give some kind of hope to his story, some kind of forward momentum. In the original kind of the first iteration, it was really Jamie and Kit, the owner of this converted steading where they're staying in the middle of the woods, who had the central relationship. But she was really there for sort of comic effect. And as the story developed, I realized that she was a much more interesting and important character. When Alex and Jamie arrive at the steading, they don't realize that she's actually living in the building. So in some ways, she is a bit like a physical ghost haunting them while they're on this trip. They can hear her through the walls. They can hear her talking to herself. They can hear her moving around. And she pops up with monotonous regularity as they're making their way around this area looking for the house. In that sense, she represents in a way another kind of archetype from fairy tales, which is a kind of helpful, you have these kind of helpful animals and helpful good witches and things like that. The kind of person or animal that you would meet on a journey who gives you some kind of guidance. And in some ways, that is who Kit is. She's there to facilitate Jamie's journey in a way. She also happens to be around the same age as his parents. So I think that he's very open to drawing on maybe what he perceives as some kind of wisdom that she has. And also she's very good at getting him to open up, it seems, almost without doing anything. She also leaves sweets on the doorstep which is always nice. But I thought of that as well as being a bit like a reference to the way that in fairy tales you can have trails of breadcrumbs or sweets or pebbles or something like that. And in the end, she shares a story with Jamie that is in some ways like a ghost story. She is telling Jamie the story of her life. And I think it shows to him that this is what life is. We build up these experiences, good and bad, positive and negative, but that's what life is. And in Kit's case, she is someone who has come out the other end, and there's a lot of grace about her as a character. For all the experience that she's had, good and bad, she's come out of it with a very kind of sanguine attitude. And I think that's something that Jamie learns from.
And I've just been thinking as you've been telling us about Kit that this is a first person narrative. We experience the stories through Jamie's consciousness and through his eyes. And so you're revealing as much about Jamie in how you characterize Kit, because it starts out, she's laughable. She's a bit maybe eccentric and maybe going to be a little bit of not a thorn in
Like a
their side, but a
mutant.
little bit, she's going to cramp their style a bit. They didn't think that they were going to be sharing their living quarters, the building, that she'd be on the other side of the wall. And she's, I think, incredibly intuitive, and she senses something in Jamie that I'm not sure Jamie knows he gives off, but he certainly does give it off. And Kit picks up on it fairly quickly. To me, the pivotal scene with their relationship was when they bump into her. She's everywhere. She's just like always turning up everywhere. They leave the house and they run into her, and she's at this cafe. And then Alex gets a phone call, so he leaves, and they just have this incredible conversation. And there was just something so true and expansive about the kind of force field that opened up between them in that moment. And she ends up becoming a really important person to Jamie and in coaxing him along on his journey with grief. And it's just incredible. So, yeah, well done, sir.
Thank you. I think that in some ways, with Jamie, although, as you said, he is solitary and he's a watchful character, he's not socially gregarious like Alex is. But he does, in a way, crave connection. And I think he does crave connection at this particular time. He wants to be told how to do this part of his life, and he wants to be helped. And Kit is someone who can help him.
Absolutely. I suppose even the author might think it's strange that I wanted you to tell us about Kit before we learn more about Alex, but so be it. I loved Alex too, and we really meet Alex at the beginning of the chapter early in the novel called A Book of Fairy Tales, if you would read that short section.
Yeah, absolutely. Something woke me, a beat or a breath. For a couple of scary moments, I tried to locate familiar things. We had come on holiday, that was it. We'd fetched up in a room filled with teddies in someone else's house in the middle of a forest. Alex was here. He was right next to me. Alex, bumfled in the covers, was trying to speak in that dream way, like his mouth was sewn shut. Alex. He put a hand on his chest, his gasps turning to breathed laughter. Ah, he said, ah, his heart like a drill. He turned over, and I felt him spread and settle once again. Enjoy this, I told myself. Enjoy him. But I was alert now, fixated on the mass of dark between the bed and the door. There was nothing to see, but I lay there for who knows how long, trying to make the darkness move like water.
Yes, Alex and he, it's a fairly new relationship. If I'm remembering correctly, he was just starting to meet up with him when Jamie's father died. And so now they've been together maybe 9 months or 10 months or something like that.
I think the thing about Alex is that obviously the relationship is quite new. Alex is a very different person. He's an actor. He's often out of work, but he does fret about getting work. He's much more flamboyant than Jamie. He also has a really very different background. I would say he's more middle class, but he's mixed race. His father was Indonesian, his mother was Irish, and he grew up in a large family with lots of brothers and sisters in a rural area. For more than one reason, he stuck out like a sore thumb. Alex is somebody who has ghosts as much as Jamie does, as much as Kit does. But his experience has turned him into really quite a different character. But I feel in a way that they have each found the nut to their bolt. I think that they're clearly very compatible. And some people have asked me when I've been doing readings and things like that, they've been very eager to know, do they stay together? It's certainly my hope that they stay together. And I think that Alex appearing in Jamie's life at this particular time, it means that the kind of usual, I suppose, the challenges of early courtship are dispensed with in a way, and everything gets hurried up a little bit. So they're at that point in the relationship, they're almost like the hump in the road that you have to get over, where you decide whether or not you're going to commit or just drift out. But so far they've had really quite an intense time of it. And I think that's made them very close. And I think maybe that scares Jamie a little bit, but my feeling is that they're meant for each other.
Yeah, they seem really good together. And in certain important ways, it wasn't really the story of their relationship. It wasn't incidental. It was absolutely an important part of the story, but it wasn't the story. And I think that's why I appreciated the portrayal of that relationship and maybe why it was as powerful as it was. And you're right. What was the phrase? I haven't heard it quite that way before. They were the nut to each other's bolt. That's lovely.
Yeah.
And the sense I had of Alex, the strongest thing that I felt about him was that he cared and he wanted to help. He didn't necessarily know how to help, but he listened and he shared stories from his own life, and that was very beautiful. And I had the sense that what he proffered may not have quite hit the mark as much as what Kit did in that one conversation for Jamie, but it was certainly enough.
Yes, and being the partner of an actor, a kind of jobbing actor, wouldn't necessarily be a walk in the park in and of itself. Maybe something that Jamie realizes in the course of this story is that this is the next chapter in his life, him and Alex, and that involves push and pull. Sometimes it just so happens that Jamie's going through this very sad bereavement at the moment, and Alex is really there for him. He's certainly trying his very best. But there are also challenges to do with Alex's profession, how often he works and doesn't work, and what that means for his own sense of his own identity. And of course, he drops everything to go away to an audition. So Jamie gets to see Alex, warts and all, I suppose, which is probably a good thing.
We haven't talked very much yet about the house from Jamie's childhood memory, that they eventually, Kit seems to talk to somebody that thinks they know where it is. And so there's an expedition out to see this house. And we don't need to get into all the details of who lives there and so on. But to me, what that brought into such sharp focus was the impermanence, the untrustworthiness of memory. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that by the time he's left the house, he's not really sure if it was that house.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose that is really the central theme of the book, is the ways that we make sense of the present by telling ourselves stories about our lives, don't we? But life doesn't have that kind of shape to it. But that's how we experience it. We give it that shape. And I think we do that especially in moments of crisis. And that's what Jamie's doing, is that he's making his life, in especially his relationship with his parents, into a story. And he's fully aware. In fact, at various points, he says things like, this definitely happened, but it didn't happen that way. And time makes everything out of scale, or it makes everything seem slightly off kilter. The reality of this was undoubtedly different. And I think that when it comes to the house, he's idealizing the house and what it represents as having been this very happy moment in his relationship with his mum and dad. we've all done that. We've all been to that amazing party or on that amazing trip, and then years later said, let's go back. Or even the following year, let's go back and do it again. And it never quite lives up to your expectations. And I remember trekking around somewhere with a friend of mine trying to find this beautiful park. It was when I was in London and I just couldn't find it. And then I started to wonder if it actually existed. So that's the idea of the old haunts, isn't it? That you have this idealized version in your head. The reality is quite different.
And there's a juxtaposition there to the fact that the flat above the shop where he grew up, that's gone. The purple shop. And so I think possibly that's why this quest is so important to him. And all that stuff about the trickiness of memory comes up.
Because he wanted to show Alex the shop and the building's been demolished. And his parents at one point sold the shop and the flat and moved to a new build, like a small new build house, which they are thrilled by, but Jamie is
Not so thrilled by.
not thrilled by at all, because it's not his childhood. It's a new build house, which is warm and cozy for the parents. And I suppose it's about the next stage in their lives, their retirement and so on. But Jamie's doesn't have any emotional connection to it.
Maybe my last question before we talk about some other related topics is, and I don't quite know how to phrase it, so you can choose how to answer it any way you wish, but this is such a quiet, character-driven novel. There's very little that happens. It's not like nothing happens. There's momentous things that happen, mostly kind of recollected in grief rather than happening in the present of the novel. I love fiction like this, and this was just a joy to read and to sink down into. So I'll ask it rather bluntly. Why are you like this as a writer? What makes you write this kind of fiction?
I think probably number one, these are the kinds of books that I actually quite enjoy reading. I mean, I really love 19th century fiction, and I love those big sort of sprawling tomes where it's 800 pages and you go through many hundreds of named characters and you can get really lost in it. But I'm not sure I've got it in me to write that kind of book. I actually really love reading slim books. I'm a huge admirer of writers who can write with economy, but also with lyricism, that mix of, I really can't stand flat prose. And I love writing that's alive, but that is distilled. And I think that's what I aspire to in a way.
Can
I
you throw
remember
out some names, either titles or authors for us?
one that always comes to mind is Muriel Spark. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is probably one of my favorite books of all time. It's only 120, 130 pages, something like that. And it really does take you through decades in the life of this teacher in an Edinburgh school who has a set of 6 girls who she singles out or she groups together as being her set that she can, I suppose, shape in her image. And the book goes down a very dark road of kind of sex and manipulation. And then into the war years, we learn about Miss Brodie's fascination with Mussolini and fascism. But I absolutely love her ability to get so much across with such kind of speed and lightness in such a kind of short book. But also I've always been a big fan of short stories, and I love Dubliners. I like Catherine Mansfield's and some of the other modernist short story writers. I'm a big fan of Annie Proulx and Mavis Gallant and Alice Munro also
Oh, yeah, now you're talking.
yeah. So I'm in awe of how these writers tell so much in such a short space. And I suppose that's what I aspire to. The other one I think is maybe the way that I've ended up writing, my sort of writing process. I mean, I had a background as a short story writer, publishing short stories, but also pieces for radio and things like that. And quite often, if you are commissioned to write a short story, it's to a very specific length. So you have to learn discipline and editing. And I was a journalist, I still am a journalist. So I have that background as a kind of sub-editor and writing for newspapers where you're working for an editor who quite often will come back to you about your work and say, I need this to be cut, I need it to be augmented, and I need it done immediately. So you do learn that discipline of being able to cut and reshape things really quickly. And certainly the book I've been working on more recently, I have learned to write scenes and work on them. And then after that, there's almost like a process of assemblage rather than writing things from start to finish. You know, I kind of write these scenes and then think, okay, that should go there and that should go there. And it's almost building something up rather than having a kind of plan of that goes from A to B. So that's why. But I would love to be able to write a huge, sprawling epic.
I would read it, but I don't need you to change anything about what you're doing. There's a part of this novel that your answer hasn't addressed, and you've given a very full answer, which I very much appreciate, but there is something about your vision. There is a utterly unsentimental soulfulness to the story that you have written that the closest I can come, and I hope you'll take it as a big compliment, to compare it to would be Michael Cunningham. Have you read him?
Yes, I've read The Hours and I've read A Home at the End of the World.
It's
Yeah, which
that
is
novel in particular that there's some kind of deep resonance just because of how much that novel meant to me when I first read it and when I was much younger.
Yeah.
And lots of differences too, but that vision, like I say, there's no sentimentality here. It was an extremely emotional read. And yeah, it's just absolutely beautiful. And I'd like to ask you, what are you working on now?
So I am working on another novel which is called Playing Houses, and it's all being well, it'll be published later in the year. And I'm at the kind of editing stage of that, which is interesting because, again, in the kind of writing process, it's really good to have a break from something and come back to it and see the things that you're chuffed with, that you're quite pleased with, and the things that make you squirm or that your eye catches on and that have to be removed immediately. I wouldn't want to say too much more about that just now. I'd be very happy to come and talk to you about it again.
I'd like to pre-book you. That sounds great. Alan, have you been reading anything interesting recently?
Yes, I have read quite a lot over Christmas, including the new Elizabeth Strout book, Tell Me Everything, which I spoke to you a lot about. I would definitely recommend that. It's a book where she brings a lot of the characters from her previous novels together, which she has a lot of fun with, and it's a lot of fun to see how these relationships develop. One other book which really stayed with me quite powerfully is The Vegetarian by Han Kang.
Okay.
Han Kang, Korean writer, won the Nobel Prize last year. And I hadn't read any of her work, although I'd obviously heard of her and I had friends who recommended her work. And I read The Vegetarian. There are 3 discrete sections to this novel. And it was one of those ones where, as I started reading it, I was thinking, I'm not sure what's happening here. I'm not sure if I'm enjoying this. I'm actually not feeling anything. This book is leaving me cold. By the time I'd finished it, and it's quite a short book, it's only 200 odd pages, I felt completely haunted by it. It really had an emotional impact on me. It's a very difficult book to describe, but I would urge people, if they haven't read anything by Han Kang, to read The Vegetarian. Quite, in some ways, grotesque, but also, in the end, really quite moving.
I got stuck in probably around the same place that you felt like you were stuck and that you weren't sure where this was going, and I put the book down at that point. So I've really carried that dislike to the present day. So if you got something out of it, I might consider picking it back up again, trying again.
I can totally see. I had that experience where I was thinking, do you know, I'm not sure if I'm really enjoying this and if it's worth my while. I would be interested to hear what you thought having completed the book. Yes, if you have time.
No promises, but I will take that under advisement, as they say. Allan, thanks for such a wonderful chat about such a wonderful book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a huge pleasure.